All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Roberta Manell Montero. It's May 10th, 2023. We're at Seven Springs Vineyard in Salem. And thank you so much, Damien and the team here, for letting us use their space today. Roberta, thank you for being with us. And the first question...
Delighted to be here, and it's such a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day in the valley. First question for you is, why wine?
Because I think wine is an expression of community and culture. And it's why I wanted to be part of not just the wine scene in general, but more importantly here in Oregon. My background is not one that has involved wine. It's interesting, when I started exploring the thought of why wine.
Mm-hmm.
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Mm-hmm.
I went back to the time just after university when I was traveling around Europe, and the sense and the presence of wine as a normal everyday part of their lives. And interestingly, I got to spend a good portion of a year living with a family that had, they made their own wine, they grew grapes, and they made it in a co-op. But I got to get a feel for how living in a village where everybody had that in common, that level of community and that level of attention and care, and the way it flowed through their entire lives. It's not a 9-to-5 job, obviously. And just the people that were part of their community and more widely were who I wanted to be involved with. And so even though my background didn't involve wine at all, I started looking in that direction when I returned from Europe and came straight to California at the time. I should digress and say that my studies didn't involve wine at all. I actually have a degree in foreign service. My parents were diplomats, and I wanted to follow that track that had given me a lot of, actually a great life and adventures as a result of that travel. But I started thinking a little bit differently. My life kind of made a little bit of a left turn when I came back to California, and I started looking at what angle I could use to become part of this industry, given that I didn't have the production background that I thought you needed to do so. And so this was back in the early mid-'80s when times were tough. You were not able to get a job almost anywhere. And I was fortunate in that I did find a job at Calera, actually, with Steve Dorner and his team. But my job was labeling bottles with the other Mexican ladies in the team. And it was great because I spoke Spanish fluently. We got on. And then during lunch breaks, I'd take time off, and I'd be sitting, I can vividly remember sitting right on top of one of the tanks outside. In fact, it wasn't just with Steve and Richard, it was also with Randall Graham, Bonnie Doon, who was making wine there. And it was really a very important experience. And then from there, I ended up getting a full-time job at Navarro Vineyards in the Anderson Valley, which again is not really, at the time it was really kind of the backwaters, and just starting to get to know it itself beyond orchards. And I was fortunate to meet my former husband John there, and he brought me into the wine community in the sense of tastings and in the sense of being invited to participate in Steamboat. And the Steamboat Conference for me was life-changing in a sense. It completely reaffirmed the whole reason why I pursued this different path. And allowed me to get that much more deeply connected with people, particularly people from Oregon, but from further afield as well. So winemakers from California, as well as winemakers from other countries, including New Zealand. And that eventually led me and John to take on a new adventure and establish a vineyard in Central Otago. And at the same time, keeping my presence here in Oregon, as people would wait until I'd finish vintage, and then I'd come back and interact with them in the capacity of my selling wine barrels. So I guess I need to back up and thank Vincent for taking me on, Vincent Bouchard, at a time in my life when I wasn't quite sure what aspect, what facet within the wine business I'd be happiest with. I knew I wanted to be able to travel. I love the number of people that I met through Steamboat and through other avenues. John and I were also invited to go overseas and visit wineries in Burgundy, in Alsace, in Champagne, and a lot of friendships from that aspect. I speak French, so that made it a bit easier as well. But I am delighted that I am able to have a career whereby I get to learn something new every day, get to learn to meet new people, or people that I have come to treasure really over the years. I get an excuse to visit them at least once a year, and so I'm delighted to be continuing that. This is my 30th year working with Oregon winemakers, and I just look forward to every morning.
So I want to back up, because you mentioned sort of life before wine being kind of interesting for you. So tell me about growing up, parents as diplomats. What was that like? Where were you, and what were some of the memories and adventures you had?
I was born in Mexico, in Mexico City, and growing up we had nannies, as one does when you're overseas. And my parents interacted quite a bit with, I guess, local, on the ambassador level, as well as with people more locally. And I thought I had an absolutely wonderful childhood. I remember, going to the zoo and riding on ponies, and just things that didn't involve perhaps the more typical upbringing here in the States. I never got to wear blue jeans. I remember my first pair of blue jeans when I was a teenager, finally. But we went from there always back to Washington, D.C. And then I've spent time living in Chile, primarily in Santiago, but we would go to the coast as well, to Valparaiso, and the area around Casablanca. A little bit further to the north has become now quite well known for their wines. And we then went back to DC, and then back out to Venezuela. And I remember always being in schools that were both bilingual and run by, in some instances, the oil companies. So it was an unusual upbringing. I didn't really get the opportunity to have long-range friendships, which is why having this sense of community for me here within the wine business has become such a driving force and such an important part of my history here with Oregon winemakers. I love it.
So with that kind of background and with the thought in your head that you were going to kind of do something similar with your studies in your life, how did wine become how did you become aware of it? How did you become interested in it in the first place?
I think that didn't really happen on an in-depth basis until after I had graduated from university. I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and then traveled around as most people do just after university, and just try to get a sense of really to what degree I wanted to take this. I wanted not to jump into anything right away, and I ended up wanting to learn German because I'd met so many people when I was in Germany that were so helpful. And it wasn't even on my radar to learn German. I thought Spanish, French, good enough. I'd actually learned a little bit of Russian as well, thinking that would be useful for me. But I fell in love with the people that I was getting to know in Germany and stayed there to learn. And then was actually even working in Germany. And then, in fact, in in a little town called Klösterreichenbach in the depths of the Black Forest. And it was there that I met a family, actually in Baden-Baden, that I became very close with, and they, staying with them and getting to know how their life was so immersed with the vines that they were tending and the wine they were making, and how integral that was, integrated in such a way that it gave them great pleasure to wake up very early in the morning and have a life that was seamless. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It wasn't a job where politics entered into all aspects of consideration, and I decided that's more what I was interested in doing.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned from there kind of taking the leap to California. So of all the places you had seen and all the places you could have gone, why did you choose to go to California?
Well, there was a very personal and important reason. My mom was in California, in Monterey, and I wanted the chance to spend time with her, and this was also getting away from D.C., which is where I spent a good portion of my time growing up, and certainly my university days. I didn't like the humidity either on the East Coast. That was a factor moving out here, and I loved it out here, and so I wanted some way to continue to facilitate that. At the time, when I got the job at Navarro Vineyards, I had a bicycle. That's how I got back and forth to work. The loggers got to know me on the road. They gave me plenty of wide berth. Eventually I did get a car, and that was primarily so I could go back to see my mom down in Pacific Grove. And again, because of John's connections with others in the wine industry, I started to gravitate towards Oregon, and certainly the Steamboat Conference played a huge part in my desire to spend more time up here and get to know people that were also forging their own adventures and destinies within a rapidly growing and super interesting place to grow grapes.
So before we get to Oregon, before we get to Steamboat, I'm curious about, as you entered into the industry and you were working on the kind of the sales and marketing side, what did you discover about that part of the industry? What was exciting about wine at that time, and what sold wine? What were people looking for?
Well, part of what I did was I worked selling wine in California. I worked at the Oakville Grocery, which is in the epicenter of the Napa Valley. And at the time that I worked there, it was also really still finding its identity. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was always the winemakers that could allow vineyard character to come through. Always, those wines really entrance me, and I think that's been the case all throughout the various paths that I've chosen. Those are the people that I enjoy talking with.
So Steamboat, obviously a pretty seminal moment, seminal kind of conference for Oregon wine, especially. You mentioned that it wasn't just for Oregon. So tell me about how you got introduced to it and sort of your initial memories of Steamboat.
This was probably as of the mid-'80s. And so Steve and Carrie and Don were there at the time organizing it. And fly fishing was definitely an important part of it, but because I didn't have that as my focus, I tended to gravitate to going up a little bit further up the Umpqua River to an area that had this incredible waterfall and swim hole, and that's where a lot of us would gather in the afternoons when it was a beautiful sunny day, and we would talk about things beyond wine. But the friendships that I made there have stayed with me through to this day. The fact that this was a place that's pretty remote, or relatively remote at the time. People couldn't go back home. They were there. They needed to. There was no phone. There was a phone booth. There weren't cell phones then, and there wouldn't have been signal anyway. It just meant you had to leave everything behind. I was able to participate in the tasting of experimental wines and just the improvement, as Stephen puts it, of the breed. And it's amazing how fast that happened because of the sharing of information. That sharing is part of that sense of community that I talk about, that I have loved so much. And a lot of it revolves around Pinot, because it was always a very difficult variety to get right, both in terms of growing as well as in making it. And fortunately, there are very generous winemakers from other corners that came, beyond California, from Europe. Certainly, there are guest winemakers that came from Germany, Switzerland, as well as France, and then of course New Zealand and Australia. And these people I also got to be friends with in ways that later defined this desire to have an adventure in New Zealand, be part of the new, the discovery of a region, or the discovery of a region that at the time just had a bare hint of potential, and that's Centro Otago, which is at the 45th parallel and the further south Vinny wine region. And the friendships with Clive Patton and with Larry McKenna, and with just a number of winemakers that came that really excited us to go even further afield than Oregon, and perhaps be part of this new generation, or at least a generation that was discovering. Rather, Oregon at the time was actually finding it. It had already found its foot, just starting to explore different areas. But we wanted to be part of the earlier generation of discovery. And so that took us on a journey that lasted well over 15 years. So we did that in the early 2000s. And we had, a fantastic adventure, as I had hoped. It wasn't easy, as it wasn't easy here, because there wasn't any kind of trained labor staff. We were doing a lot of the work ourselves and with a lot of people from the community. And John actually was a real leader in that regard. He understood what it took to not only grow grapes, but grow them for winemaking. We were one of the very few grape growers that weren't doing it just for ourselves, for making wine. We sold the majority of our fruit. I would say 90% of our fruit we sold. And John and our vineyard, Pisa Terrace, came to be known for the quality of the fruit. He was the first person to bring a pressure bomb to New Zealand so that we could actually measure the uptake of water. The area, I should digress, the area where we decided to plant a vineyard in Central Otago has very bony soil. It's just, you need to irrigate, especially when you're establishing a vineyard. We took what was a bare paddock, as they say, filled with lucerne, otherwise known as alfalfa. And this site that was almost like a little island, falls off on all sides except for one, was a very special, beautiful site, similar to where we are now, in that it had beautiful aspect. And it was a real joy to work there, and a struggle to get the first vines to really get going. But over the years, we got to know the site well. We planted it to clonal selections that are both Dijon clones, as well as one that's a suitcase clone from DRC that was then known as the Abel clone. And we got all this information by, again, the wonderful sharing of information that all the winemakers that I visited while I was selling barrels there would offer to give us. And certainly I'd be tasting and paying attention to clonal selections as much as I was to how the barrel was fitting with their wines. But that was also a terrific community to be part of. But coming to Oregon, and every year, coming back in April, and then having that be my focus, has always been the constant that I've just loved and appreciated. I think there's a crossover between Central Otago in particular, other regions as well, certainly Nelson and Canterbury and Marlborough with Oregon. And there's always been a kind of a cross-pollination of ideas and people. And so I love the fact that I was bridging both. And I help people get jobs in both areas as a result. And I love that I could be that kind of almost a courier of info back and forth. I've never had formal training in winemaking, but I've learned through osmosis, and that's been, and through tasting certainly, and that's been really helpful. So Bouchard Cooperages is who I continue to work with, Vincent Bouchard, and we represent coopers from France, from Hungary, from Austria now, and we also work with suppliers of oak adjuncts and amphoras. So a pretty wide range, and what is kind of unique is we act in the capacity of a broker and not a direct rep, and that gives us the flexibility to be as much an advocate for the wineries as I am for the cooperages and suppliers that I work for. And that for me is a big difference, because there is no perfect barrel for all varieties. And that's, it's fortunate that I work with family-owned businesses that are looking at the long-term goal, the long-term benefits of their barrels. They're passing them down to the next generation as well. So they're not looking at short-term profits, and they're smaller by nature. And so they're a very good fit for wines that I found I was having to pair with the barrels. It's been a way for me certainly to have a livelihood, because the winery in Central Otago, while it was a great joy during the time that we farmed it, was not exactly where we earned money. It gave us tremendous satisfaction and pleasure, and the wines that we ended up making and that others made from our fruit gave me a lot of satisfaction. Selling it was a different story. We could receive all sorts of great reviews, but going on the road selling wine was a very different story. Although I'm happy to say that we actually did have our wine here, placed in Oregon for a period of time. And so, I did make that happen at least. But I'm better at working with on the supplier side and assisting winemakers to find barrels or vessels that enhance what they're doing, what they're spending the entire year doing in farming their fruit, to get a real good expression, not only of varietal, but a sense of place. And that's my bias, I guess, given that I've also been there. And that's how I approach when I go to talk with people that don't know me, first time visiting a winery, trying to get a sense of what their fruit is like, what they're looking for, what they already have on hand, and where that gap is.
This raises so many questions for me. I'm going to stick with the barrels now, because we're talking about barrels now. So I think that the role of barrels in winemaking is something that's hard to understand, or hard for outsiders to truly grasp. So tell me about. Well, first of all, let's back up a second. How did you get involved with Bouchard in the first place?
So, John was one of Vincent Bouchard's first customers at Navarro Vineyards. Robert Britton, actually, was another one of Vincent's first customers. And so we developed a friendship based on that, and Vincent would stay with us whenever he'd come to Anderson Valley, taking the long, windy road to get there. And we grew to be friends. And then when I left Navarro Vineyards, I worked in their tasting room for a couple of years, and then went to Oakville Grocery. Vincent would come in, and he says he doesn't remember this, but he would always come and buy chocolate truffles. And so we would chat. He'd come in and we'd chat. And it got to the point where Vincent realized that he had a growing business, and he needed some assistance on an organizational basis, but more importantly, to go even further afield. Mm-hmm. And he talked to me for a good 2-3 years, because I made the transition at that point to working with Duckhorn Vineyards, trying to find another possible fit. And I worked with Margaret Duckhorn, doing more in the way of marketing, sales, logistics, assisting her with that. And then at a certain point of time, Vincent kept kind of pushing me to leave my comfortable job with a golden parachute retirement and all that, very safe stuff. And finally I said yes. I wanted the ability to travel further afield, and working with Vincent and on my own terms. The one condition, and it was a hard one, the one condition that I told Vincent was that I got to keep Oregon as my territory. He took a deep breath with that, because he met his wife Kay at IPNC. So he felt very strongly about his connection with Oregon as well. But I was pretty firm about that, and he agreed. So, see, it all comes around full circle.
Full circle. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So at that point, what was the learning curve to understand what barrels you had, what barrels did, and how to start matching them up?
It was somewhat steep in the sense that I'd been tasting wine to see how the blends as a whole were best put together, but not really focusing on barrels. I did that. That was part of my job when I was at Navarro. We were invited to do that kind of thing. Certainly at Duckhorn, I focused, but not very specifically, on barrels and what they did. And then I guess I spent certainly a considerable period of time with Vincent, and hearing him talk over and over and over about certain attributes, started to get a really good idea from his lead. Mm-hmm. And from there, I've had a decent palate. It's not something that is innate to me, but that I have through experience and repetition been able to improve. And the Cooper thumbprint is not that difficult to tell the barrels apart, but describing them perhaps is. Mm-hmm. For example, I work with Damy and Billon. There we go. Probably for the longest time. And even though they're owned by the same family, the Damy family, they're quite different. The thumbprints of each of these barrels and how they interact with wines leads to very different expressions. With Damy probably being, at least the traditional toasting's a little bit more of a sweet oak, a hedonistic contribution that tends to lift fruit and floral aspects, and is easier to get to know. And Billon, who I loved and used for the wines we made in Central Otago that already had a lot of fruitiness, needed another type of expression to come through. And Billon seemed to contribute not just an oak spice note, but a way in which it added dimension on the palate. And when it was showing at its best, didn't show through as a barrel character. You had to actually look sideways at a neutral barrel or another Cooper's barrel, and you could see that it just enhanced everything that was going on within not only, again, the varietal, but the actual vineyard parcel. And I love that aspect of Billon. It's a much more difficult thing to see easily, so Billon's remained the underdog between the two Cooperages. And then, of course, we've taken on other suppliers as well. But I think when people are in a position, for example, across IPNC seminars, to taste different barrels that don't have the experience, they find it relatively easy to see that there is a difference. Mm-hmm. But it's the why there's a difference and why they prefer it that they start to get to learn with the help of winemakers explaining it to them. Mm-hmm. And so now I work in the capacity of showing winemakers what it is that's the only thing I can do when I show up, especially when they've just started to use the barrels, is I can tell them what's typical for not only the Cooper, but for the forest origin, for the toast level, for the air dry, and those kinds of questions. So that's my value of tasting with them. Now, whether they like it or not, that's up to them and how it fits with their blend. But I can at least tell them what is showing typically and recommend, if you want a little bit more length on the palate than that's contributed by the barrel itself, then I recommend doing a toasting over embers, a long toast. And that will maybe diminish the intensity of the aromatic and flavor contribution, but it's going to give you more presence on the length and help carry the wine through in that regard. So it's endlessly fascinating to me, because what works in one area in Dundee doesn't necessarily work with Yola Hills fruit, which then, so there is no one, set of variables that is universally applicable. But I help winemakers find a workhorse barrel within our portfolio where they can kind of fit it with different parcels, and then more specifics.
Well, we talked a little bit before we started rolling, and you mentioned earlier that a lot of what you're working with is kind of smaller, family-owned, long-term thinking wineries. So tell me about. Obviously, for some of those, a barrel is a big investment. It's a big deal to pick a barrel, and you're going to have to live with it for a while. So tell me about what are people's sort of biggest needs and concerns, and sort of what do you feel your role is in terms of sort of guiding towards that proper choice?
Well, I take it very personally because especially when it's a smaller winery, they need that barrel choice to be spot on. They can't lose it in the blend. And so I like to taste then from neutral barrel and perhaps from barrels that they already know, and get a sense for what they want, what they're looking for. Are they looking for a point of contrast, or are they looking for something that's along the same lines but maybe get just a bit different? Whether they're looking to, what percentage it plays in their total blend. Do they want a little more impact because they're then going to be dialing it back with more neutral wood? So I have to get a good sense of what they're looking for, and then I can start to hone in on suggestions. And I've gotten pretty good at it over the years, but like I said, I'm always learning something new, and so I keep good written notes so that we don't have to repeat things. When I go to visit them, I always have a notepad with them, and so I'll often pick up the story from where we left off the previous time I visited and find out how did this particular trial fare, and just kind of gradually hone in and fine-tune what works for their fruit. And that becomes a changing story too, especially if you're working with young fruit that then matures, and you have a different set of needs at that point, from the puppy dog, pretty fruit of young vineyards to more mature vineyards that perhaps have already they just need to have a foil within which to further enhance what's already there, as opposed to fill in the gaps when all you've got is prettiness going on. And that's why I find what I'm doing endlessly fascinating. And I love that yearly excuse to visit people that I've really enjoyed and become friends with over the years, and more importantly, help with the evolution of their wines and helping them make better wines.
So, from your perspective, then, and obviously you have a pretty strong perspective here, how much role does barrel choice make in end result, in the end product that goes into the bottle?
There's no doubt that it's a component, and it can sway a direction. And I think when the winemaker is going through, here it is, it's just about harvest, and you're going through and you're sampling, winemaker starts to get a little bit of a feel already what characteristics are in the fruit that are different from the previous vintage, and what he wants to accomplish. And so we don't have the luxury, like they do in Burgundy, of ordering the barrels after the fruits come in. So it's always the best crystal ball guess. And so what I have to help winemakers obtain is, likely fits, regardless of whether it's ends up being a really cool vintage or a very warm one.
I think this is one of those parts of the wine industry. Like I said, I think it's a mystery to a lot of people. So I'm curious from your perspective. It kind of feels like magic. It's one of those magic things about winemaking where you can take grapes and put them into a lot of different vessels and get a lot of different things out of them. So I think I'm curious.
Well, for example, now I'm actually, the last 5-6 years, I've been working with suppliers of amphoras. And, initially I didn't know what I was getting into. I knew that it was for more than just natural winemakers, but I really didn't know. And so now I have much better sense of what they can contribute. In Burgundy, for example, they started looking at amphoras because they had these warmer and warmer vintages. And they didn't have a way of reassessing their vineyards and what they needed, what barrels they needed, what toast levels they needed. They needed a pure prism within which to view them. And so a few, winemakers like Rouleau, they ended up buying some, as an example, Vanitaire jars, which would allow them to look at the fruit itself. And they saw that beyond it just being that one-off type of purchase, they liked the way in which the shape of the barrel, the shape of the vessel could also contribute this wonderful texture to the wine, especially the more rounded shape, the more egg-like shape, and that ability to retain freshness, vitality, and nervousness, and yet textural development, the interaction with the leaves, gave them yet another way to view their vineyard parcels that they loved. So that was a real eye-opener for me when I started seeing them across Oregon fruit, including Pinot. They can overshadow the wine, and I sigh because so does Vincent and Jerome and the other coopers that I work with. They don't like it when their barrels are used as maquillage. That's what Jerome would whisper in my ear, makeup. They really want their barrels and vessels to be used in a supportive way to enhance everything that the season is all about, which is the fruit that's been growing all season long, and to reflect that the vintage. And so that's when I think a barrel is used properly, and that's my whole bias is towards that. And my bias also is to looking at the barrel by itself, that one particular barrel with those particular specs. Does it make the wine as a whole, make it does it really make for a complete wine? And I always admit this when I'm going to visit winemakers that I've not met before. I'm not looking at it as a blend component, but does this barrel as a whole? So I excuse myself in that regard. I'm very aware, though, that particularly when you have larger blends, you sometimes, and especially if you don't have a huge oak budget, you want a little more exaggeration from the barrel, whether it be on the front or middle, in terms of giving you more textural weight and more flavorsome barrel, or whether you really want a lot of clarity and precision, minerality coming through, in which case you want kind of a more reined-in version. And even within one cooper, you can have a lot of diversity in how that is accomplished, and that's where I've become just more knowledgeable across everybody that I visit. And it's a cumulative effect and a cumulative knowledge that I then, again, I can't apply, this works here, it's going to work there. It's always very specific to what the winemaker's vision is with the fruit parcels that he works with.
So I'm going to change here and talk about New Zealand a little bit, because I'm really curious about that. So you mentioned kind of the frontier of Central Otago, the potential of there. So tell me about the decision to put roots down there, and sort of the initial impressions as you were looking around for a place to grow.
Well, this happened right around the end of the 90s. Again, Steamboat being very influential, and the wines that we tasted there. And then I mean, at one point we were strongly considering Nelson. And Tim Finn was just not only a delightful person, but an amazing grape grower. And to this day, the Chardonnays from Nelson are outstanding, and as well as the Pinot Noirs, but that's been an evolution. And so they all were very generous with their knowledge and experience, also looking to share and gain information through their travels here. And we had been on the cusp of doing several other, adventures, and kind of were a little bit too safe about it. So we promised ourselves that the next time an opportunity came up, and the opportunity for us was a result of both John, wrapping up what he was doing with Bouchard Vineyards, as well as I guess the New Zealand dollar was quite low to the U.S. dollar. We could actually afford, $1 million place, because it was only 33 cents to the dollar. It's like, whoa, here come the Kiwi million. But it was, a blip in time, and we knew that was a blip in time. And so we thought long and hard about where we wanted to do it, and it was almost a toss of the coin between Nelson and Centro Otago. But in the end, Nelson was more similar to Carneros, where John had been making wine, and we decided, let's go somewhere that's completely different, even though we know that it's going to be that much tougher. The infrastructure is not there. And so that's what we decided to do. At the time, there were no real estate companies that were like, this is up. I mean, it was always a matter of, I think this farmer might have a wee bit of land that they may be willing to sell, and let's go knock on their door kind of thing. And that's how we found Pisa Terrace. It was not in. This was considered a crazy move on our part because it was way beyond where other vineyards had been established. It was not next to Felton Road, for example, which a lot of people used as the barometer of are you in a good spot or not? And but we felt a real strong connection to this particular piece of property, and we developed it from basically a paddock of lucerne, alfalfa, and we dug a lot of soil pits trying to understand the piece of property, and lo and behold, there was so much in the way of difference within that one little island. This is 16 hectares total. Just shocking, the amount of different soil profiles. But generally speaking, it was an alluvial type of soil. There was a lot of, calcaric elements there. That whole area was an inland sea basin. So it's interesting. I mean, there was an actual limestone, but there were the residue of a lot of fossils and that kind of thing in that area that we dug. By the way, we dug quite deep, and the alfalfa is notorious to go quite deep. So we had a pit that was going down, probably, 2.5 meters, and we still found alfalfa down there. So we thought, well, the roots aren't going to have any difficulty making their way down. Yeah, the difficulty we had initially was the alfalfa was very strong competition. Mm-hmm. And so getting the baby vines to take up, was quite dramatic. We were the first ones in the entire area to use gasp metal posts. And it's like everybody went, whoa, what are they doing? And we ended up having to get teak end posts from Australia because it was really difficult to find anything of quality that would last and support the long rows that we wanted to plant. Rabbits were the most difficult challenge during the time that these baby vines were taking hold. They just were everywhere. There was no predator for rabbits, so they just proliferated, and they just loved the growing leaves. And we put, I guess, milk cartons around them. They weren't enough, so then we put these big plastic guards around them. But that had its challenges as well, because then when we tried to single shoot them so that they would have a nice, strong, sometimes they inverted, and it just was a little bit more challenging. Eventually we learned that we could get, or at least they became available vines that were already up to the wire level when you purchased them. And that certainly was a big improvement for viticulture within Central. A lot of people switched to those, so they didn't have to deal with their poor vines being gnawed down to nothing. But the other aspect that was interesting, and to some degree Oregon has now felt this, is the touch of frost. Where we were was right against the base of a tall mountain, the Pisa mountain range, and we would often have snow on the peaks and around bud breaks still, and we would have katabatic winds that would come down off those snow areas, especially it just snowed recently, and there's very little you can do to combat that when it sucks, the little precious layer of warm air above. So we experienced frost, probably at least that kind of frost with no inversion layer, at least 4 times during the time we were farming. And they were called 100-year, it'll never happen again frosts. And yeah, after a year, the first time when we had we used, by the way, helicopters to protect our vineyard because, of course, it didn't frost very often, quote unquote. And the helicopters are as common as pickup trucks in that part of New Zealand. It's just, they're used to ferry people, tourists, ferry equipment around, and so the rotors of the helicopters basically kept the air moving, and in some instances where we'd have a big Huey, they would, the actual engine itself would warm up, and so what didn't work that well, but we still continued using, were frost pots. And they'll probably protect a bay or two, but that's about it. We eventually got a tow and blow, which I don't think is common here. A tow and blow is basically a fan that you can move to wherever direction you think that the wind is going to be coming from, and you can actually guide the wind. So in our instance, we had, as I described earlier, kind of a little island that then fell off on almost all sides. And so what we wanted to do was encourage the air to move off and to move down the slope. And that worked fairly well. When we purchased the land from the McMillans, the farmers that we purchased it from, we had made them a promise that we wouldn't put up a big noisy fan. And we held true to our promise, but once we ended up selling our land, and we finally did that to Mount Edward, who was the primary purchaser of our fruit since the beginning. Actually, they were very much instrumental in what clonal selections we also chose. They immediately put a fan up and got rid of the tow blow. But every region has their own set of challenges. But that frost that we got last year, 2022, here in Oregon at the very beginning, I'd experienced that already quite a few times, and my gut feeling, given that they weren't out very far and it was an elevation issue as well, was that she'll be right. One of the few times I could say that. And so I immediately ordered a lot of stock barrels. People were very cautious, very concerned. And I'm glad I did, because I've never sold so many barrels as last season. It was the largest. But so I have my, in that regard, having my experience in New Zealand has helped. You know, it's helped me with knowledge that has helped me address issues here. I'm by no means a viticulturalist or an expert, but I knew our block very well, and some of the experiences are transferable. But the most important experience is empathy with what's going on through the growing season here in Oregon.
It's an interesting way to phrase that, empathy with the growing season, for sure. Because it seems like every year offers up something that you need to be empathetic about.
Every year has its own issues, and that's one of the things that I enjoyed about Steamboat, is that would be addressed. So what was the theme and what was the challenge of the season? How did you address it? And of course, people would bring not only their problem child wines, but also their I did this right, or I got there. And it was great to have both. And I'm really happy that was part of what Steamboat was about. I've certainly also attended the Southern Pinot Noir Workshop, which has also performed a very similar role. This was in New Zealand, in Hamner Springs. Lynette Hudson has done a very fine job in running that, and in fact even bringing that on the road to Austria this past vintage. So Austria now has their version of Steamboat going on.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then this is a little bit of news. I've decided to, this is my last year working with New Zealand grape growers, winemakers. And the reason for that is that the season, things are now overlapping between Oregon and New Zealand. That didn't used to be the case. With the earlier orders needed to get barrels here because of the global supply crisis. I don't know that that's going to change that much in the foreseeable future, and I was finding that I was compromising my attention both to Oregon and to New Zealand, and something had to give. So guess what? Lynette is going to take over for me. I couldn't wish for anything better for the winemakers that I've been working with. So Lynette will be selling barrels in her spare time or in her downtime, and but still available to make wine. She's been making wine for her own label, and this year was fortunately a very, very good one for Canterbury. So see how it all kind of continues
and Oregon wins out again in the end. So speaking of Oregon, and you've talked a little bit about this already, but I'm curious about initial impressions of the Oregon wine industry as you were getting to know it. Obviously, you're getting to know it through Steamboat, and so tell me about the people making wine then, and the wines that you were tasting at that time.
You could see the potential so clearly, and just the energy and deep commitment by those people that were pioneers. I mean, the Ponzis, they'd always show up for Steamboat, and I knew Louisa as a kid. And, everyone, so because this has all been also organically growing as families, rather than just a migration of winemakers from other areas, it was really a homegrown kind of initial spurt of getting to know what was going on, or people that had been that wanted to grow really in a cooler climate suitable for Pinot, and that's a very different environment than what I was encountering in a number of areas in California. Yes, Carneros was really becoming quite exciting, and so was certainly Anderson Valley and areas within the Central Coast. But this was the frontier where I thought it wasn't just going to be good. There was potential for greatness. And I really wanted to be involved with that discovery process and learn from, from the Lett family, learn from people that were already getting a real sound idea of their particular vineyard. There's certain areas where it's like you have a new pair of kids, you can run faster, jump higher. Central Otago was one of them. But whenever I'm up here, I feel a whole new sense of energy as well. Maybe it's because it's away from the crowded cities. I'm not sure exactly why, but that was also a motivating factor for focusing my attention, at least, on Oregon.
And how has it changed? How has that potential become reality?
I think a lot of it has been through Vine Age. People have come to discover not only terroir and which areas are Grand Cru sites, but also you need a certain level of Vine Age before you can really see what the ultimate potential of a site is. And Oregon has, grown dramatically in their ability to realize that. There's a lot of planting still going on. There's, as we discussed when we first met, the expansion now just south of Salem, the extension of the Yola Hills area. But on the flip side of Salem, it's really becoming quite important there. I'm glad that people are continuing to look at aromatic varietals. I love Riesling. Riesling is near and dear to my heart. And yes, Brooks has been doing it forever, and I love what they have to do in Highland vineyards. But it's good to see expressions, aromatic expressions, whether they be Arnais, Ponzi, whether they be Pinot Blanc. I love what Chemeketa Community College is doing with their campus here in the Yola Hills, and encouraging experimentation, not just very traditional winemaking. So that's a huge deal in terms of getting local talent to really understand and farm their backyard, and not just needing a UC Davis winemaking certificate or Fresno. Certainly they continue to evolve the knowledge, particularly in fronts such as smoke taint. But it's been Oregon that's been on the forefront now of getting that level of understanding, along with Washington State. So they've learned a lot, certainly from Australia and their experiences. But there are a lot of new environmental factors that have come to impact wine quality and wine issues here. So the sophistication and the short span within which challenges have been understood and then kind of gone beyond has been phenomenal. Again, there's a sense of community here that I just love. There isn't this bickering, or as much. People help each other here, and it's just inherent. I found that also in most regions in New Zealand, particularly South Island. I'm biased. But I think that's where you get further along, and especially with regard to marketing and sales as well. That's so absolutely critical, because you can have great wine, but if you don't collaboratively promote that, you don't get as far. And that has been super important to being able to afford a plant. more vineyards and buy barrels and do everything else that's involved in making an even better wine.
So on that note, on barrels, how have barrel needs and desires changed in Oregon since you've been selling?
I think that people are looking towards less impactful barrels, and that's actually marched hand in hand with what's going on in Burgundy as well. And so while the Coopers maintain a very unique identity, at least the Coopers I work with, they have focused on just toastings that are more over embers as opposed to the more violent fires, as a way of getting that greater respect within the toastings for the wine and the ability to stretch the palate length so that it's more sympathetic, I guess, particularly to cooler climate varietals. And that's certainly been a trend that I've encouraged. And, we've continued to have these now proprietary barrels from our Coopers that focus on that. And then they travel here. They travel here and they taste and they see the benefits of this.
So what's next for Oregon? What's coming next in the industry here?
Well, I hope it goes beyond wine in a can. But I think part of having a very successful wine industry is having wine available on all different levels, because entry-level wine is really important, and entry-level wine should be good wine. And that leads people to trade up. Certainly finding ways to bring people that are younger drinkers into the fold is really important, and I know that's the focus of a lot of the marketing and sales effort. I think I love everything that's going on in Southern Oregon, and I've visited them very frequently. I think that there's been tremendous strides in varietals beyond Pinot and Chardonnay and aromatics, and there's just very exciting wines happening there, and they now are a focus of I guess the wine tourist traffic, as opposed to just on the way to the Willamette Valley. And so I think discovering other regions within Oregon, I mean, look at the rocks, that area now is super exciting for Syrah and for bolder varietals, and most of it's going to wineries across the river in Walla Walla, but you're seeing more wineries now take hold there, and proud of the fact that they now have their own AVA that is very unique, distinct, and just seeing other areas emerge further afield from the success that the Willamette has experienced.
And you've brought some of this up already, but what's next for you?
I want to continue working with winemakers here as long as I can. I do take time off. I do so around June and July, and I love spending time on the water. So I want to continue being fit enough to sail well. But then again, we also have a 1928 cruiser exploring the Delta. But it's, I want to see the next adventure that winemakers here choose to undergo. And we'll see whether patterns here start changing to the point where other varietals become more of interest. Cab Franc, for example, made in a Loire style. I'd love to see that. And those are some of the conversations I have as I've been making my way around this year, actually. Where's next? What are you up to next? And it's kind of that exploration. Certainly, we've seen the dramatic increase in attention to Chardonnay and the planting. I mean, it was great that Craig Williams, what was it, maybe 12, 15 years ago, planted almost entirely Chardonnay in an area that really hadn't even seen much of it. And now there's this big focus on a varietal that does so well here, sparkling wine. That's a huge growing segment within the Oregon wine industry, and rightly so, because this is an area that can get good expression with, at the lower bricks, and it's a perfect place to have that as a focus, to the point where everyone wants to have their sparkling wine, and there's really now kind of a dilemma of who has space to make it, and there are new facilities now that are in development just to handle sparkling wine needs for the entire community that wants to have that as part of their selection in the tasting room.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you.
Well, thank you so much for the chance to talk about things that I don't normally, I guess, consider as a whole. It's a pleasure.
For us as well, and thank you so much. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that you'd like to cover or that we didn't cover?
Not without being a lot more wordy. But thank you for the offer.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet us here on this beautiful spring day in the Willamette Valley, and sharing your thoughts and stories with us, and dealing with all the bugs.
Well, that's great. I mean, this is part of the whole process.
Part of what we're doing out here.
The springtime. So thank you so much.
Go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you.